Guys, welcome to another video. You've got Mr. Everything English, and today we are looking at some context for all of your English literature essays.
Everything education. Tuition for maths, English and science.
Whether you're doing Shakespeare, whether you're doing the 19th century novel, whether it's the modern text or whether it's the poetry, context is a requirement for all of them. Now, what is context, guys? Context is when you talk about wider reading, background reading, things other than the text that we can apply to the text to add to our arguments. That's essentially what context is. Now, there's some teachers out there who teach different context for different texts, which is absolutely fine. But I tend to use 2 to 3 contexts. So I use Freud, I use patriarchy, I use Butler. I tend to use 2 to 3 contexts that I apply to all of the texts. And then there's extras where if you want to use them, you can, like religion, capitalism, and so on. Now, why do I have 2 or 3 that I apply to all my texts? Because they are my backup context. I know they work in every single question for every single text. So I have them always with me to use in every single exam. And the quality of the context varies. For example, patriarchy. Patriarchy is a context that I argue every kid in the country should use and should know. Like, if you don't know patriarchy, you've not been taught properly. However, then there's certain contexts that really stands you out from your peers. And it's context that a lot of schools may not teach. And one of the contexts that I use, and there's many other contexts out there, I use Freud. Now, I learned Freud college in my degree for university. And then when I used to teach A-level English language, A-level English lit, I used Freud a lot when I was a teacher for A-level. And Freud is a very good theory to use. Me personally, I think the guy is a little bit crazy and I don't really agree with a lot of what he says. But as a theory for what he argues in this particular case, we can use it very, very easily. My personal beliefs don't really matter. Now, Freud, guys, he spoke about the human brain. He spoke about our brains. And he said, essentially, that our brain is divided into 3 sections. But these 3 sections are not equal sections. Depending upon what we're doing, depending upon how we're feeling, a certain part may overtake the other parts. Now, the only part of Freud that I want you guys to focus on is the part of the brain that he called the id. ID. Simple. ID, id. And this part of the brain, guys, is essentially what every human being in the entire country has. He said, and I agree with this part, that every human being is born with raw instincts. They're there from birth. And the 2 instincts that he spoke about is survival and worship. He spoke about our sexual desires, but we're not going to talk about that because this video will get sticky. So let's keep it to survival and worship. Now, when it comes to our survival instinct, it's the answers in the name. This is our instinct to survive. So for example, when we cross the road, we instinctively will look right and we will look left. Nobody walks into the road eyes closed thinking they're going to survive. If this building catches fire right now, I'm gonna either smash that window and get out, or I'm gonna smash that window and get out. I'm not gonna sit here and continue with the video because I'm gonna wanna survive. Think about when you're young. Guys, when I was young, I got chased by so many dogs. But for some reason, every time I got chased by a dog, I could jump over a wall so quick. Now, yes, that's because of adrenaline and there's many other reasons. But at the raw form, Freud is saying that that's our instinct to survive. Nobody wants to not survive. And you take the baby's favorite toy. What does the baby do? Baby cries, the baby feels threatened. So from a very young age, guys, we have this instinct to survive. We all feel hunger, every single one of us. And to fulfill that instinct, what do? We eat. So guys, every human being has an instinct to survive. Now you may argue, sir, but what about Eva Smith? She committed suicide. What about Lady Macbeth? She committed suicide. You may argue that that's because they're a victim of their other instinct, the worship side, which we'll go to in a second. So that's the first part, guys. Every single human being has the instinct to survive. Now, this part of the instinct can be applied to all of your GCSE text. But let's now add the second instinct. So one is that everyone wants to survive. Then we have the instinct of worship. And this is my favorite instinct because I always use this one. I very rarely use the survival instinct in my essays, but I always use the worship instinct. Now, what's the worship instinct? Freud argued that every single human being on this planet Earth worships something. Didn't say worships God, worships something. Some people worship celebrities, some people worship football teams, some people worship cars, houses, some people worship money, some people worship themselves, Ozymandias, some people worship God, but every human being worships something. And this one can be applied to our text beautifully. How? You can argue that Macbeth worshipped the idea of power. You can argue that Romeo worshipped Juliet. Mr. Burling worshipped money. Lady Macbeth, maybe her god changes throughout the play. Maybe at the beginning she worshipped power, but towards the end her god changed. Maybe she began to worship actual God. Maybe that's why the guilt became too much for her. Ozymandias, you can argue he worships himself. Who else? Who else is out there? Jekyll and Hyde, lovely example. Hyde is a worshipper of evil. Jekyll, I argue, the fact that he created Hyde in the first place shows that at the beginning he worshipped himself because all he cared about was himself. And the argument you want to make that in pretty much 99% of these books, overly worshipping something ends up in disaster. There's a fine line, and that we can apply, guys, to our lives. I know I got friends, right, who love, who worship football. And I'll see them here and there on Instagram. I want to say it, guys, and they're debating in the comment section. Ronaldo is the GOAT. No, Messi is the GOAT. These people don't even know you exist, and you're going crazy over them. And when the football's on, and they'll cancel all their plans, and they'll just become obsessed with that thing. You've got people who all they do is talk about cars and money. And if they buy a new watch, they'll pull up their sleeve and their watch is hanging out on display. It's too much. It's over the top. They see these things as so important. That's what happens. Call it infatuation, call it what you want. But Freud coined it as the id. It's that part of the brain that is overly worshipping whatever the chosen God is. Link it to our text. Macbeth worships power so much that it has no end for him. They say he is like Valor's minion, and so he is, because he worships power. He's dying to become like that, or to become an embodiment of power. That even when he becomes the king, it's not enough. He wants to be king forever and ever and ever. So you can argue that Macbeth is a slave to his id. He's a slave to his desire for power because he worships it. Who else do we have? Romeo. Even Juliet. Let's do Romeo first. Romeo is an example, guys. What does he worship? I would argue, guys, Romeo, he worships Juliet. Even when he says, guys, I defy you stars. Remember, guys, their worshipping was to stars and whatnot. So when he says, I defy you stars, he's going against his God and he replaces Juliet on that mantelpiece. And what does worshipping do to him when that part of the brain overtakes it? Remember, guys, if your id, if your instinct is what controls you, there's no thought, there's no thinking, there's no ration. Everything is impulse, everything is instinct. So because he worships Juliet, everything is done on impulse, everything is done on instinct, and it has dire consequences. It has destructive consequences. Now, what other ways can you apply it? Guys, what other ways can you apply it? Eric Burling. When Eric Burling in Act 3 arguably rapes Eva Smith, look at how he treats her. I would argue that's a reflection of him worshipping himself as a man because he thinks he's so special. But guys, look, Freud as a context is beautiful to use because number one, it's a very high level grade 9 context if you can pull it off. Number two, it can be applied to every single text. All you want to say is Freud spoke about the brain and he said the id is our raw instinct, one part being worship, and then link it. Macbeth worshipped power, the witches worshipped, I don't know, evil, Jekyll worshipped himself, Hyde worshipped being sinful, whatever your character is, and discuss the dire consequences of overly worshipping anything, which is what all these characters do. And guys, to keep it simple, if your teacher says, please don't use Freud, then you know what? For any assessment you do for them, don't use Freud and stick to whatever they want you to use. But I've always used Freud, guys. From the first time I ever taught, I've always used Freud because I think it's a lovely piece of context to chuck into any English literature essay. And if anyone says to you guys that you shouldn't use Freud, do tell them that there's published answers grade 9 by AQA that have Freud in them. Anyway guys, as always, it's been Mr. Everything English. Peace.